In November 1918, the guns finally fell silent across Europe. After more than 4 years of devastation, the World War I had come to an end. Entire landscapes had been reduced to mud and craters. Millions of soldiers had died in the trenches, and the political map of Europe was about to be redrawn. But while the fighting had stopped, the peace that followed would prove fragile, uncertain, and filled with unresolved tensions that quietly set the stage for another, even more destructive conflict. 4 great empires collapsed almost overnight. The powerful German Empire fell as revolution spread through its cities and its emperor fled into exile. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into a collection of new and struggling nations. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force in the Middle East, was dismantled by the victorious powers. And in the East, the Russian Empire had already collapsed into revolution and civil war. For the first time in centuries, the political order that had governed Europe was gone. In 1919, the leaders of the victorious nations gathered in Paris to design a new world order. Their goal, at least in theory, was simple: create a peace that would prevent another global war. At the center of these negotiations stood figures like Woodrow Wilson, Georges Clemenceau, and David Lloyd George. Each had different priorities. Wilson believed in a fair and lasting peace based on cooperation between nations. Clemenceau, representing France, wanted security above all else. France had suffered enormously during the war, and many French leaders believed Germany had to be weakened permanently to prevent another invasion. The result of these negotiations was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. On paper, it ended the war. In reality, it created a peace that many believed was deeply flawed. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war through the so-called War Guilt Clause. This single sentence would become one of the most controversial parts of the treaty. For many Germans, it felt like a national humiliation. The treaty also imposed severe penalties. Germany lost significant territory, including regions that contained valuable resources and industries. Its army was drastically reduced, its navy limited, and it was forbidden from building an air force. Perhaps most damaging of all were the enormous reparations payments Germany was ordered to make to the victorious countries. These payments were intended to compensate for the destruction caused by the war, especially in France and Belgium. But the scale of the debt was staggering. For the new German government, this situation was almost impossible to manage. After the war, Germany had transformed into a democratic state known as the Weimar Republic. It was a fragile experiment in democracy, born out of defeat and revolution. From the very beginning, it faced enemies from all sides. Many conservatives and nationalists blamed the new democratic leaders for signing the treaty. They called them traitors who had betrayed the nation. At the same time, Germany's economy began to spiral into chaos. The burden of reparations, combined with war deaths and political instability, created enormous financial pressure. By 1923, the situation reached a breaking point. The German government began printing vast amounts of money in an attempt to pay its obligations and keep the economy running. The result was one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern history. Prices rose at unimaginable speed. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks one year could cost billions the next. Workers were paid several times a day so they could rush out and spend their wages before the money became worthless. People carried stacks of banknotes in wheelbarrows just to buy basic goods. Savings that families had built over generations vanished almost overnight. The economic crisis shattered public confidence and created deep resentment toward both the government and the international system that had imposed these conditions.
While Germany struggled with economic collapse, the architects of the peace settlement hoped a new international organization could prevent future wars. This organization was called the League of Nations. Its purpose was ambitious. Nations would resolve disputes through diplomacy instead of war. If one country acted aggressively, the others would unite to stop it. The idea seemed promising, but from the very beginning, the League faced serious weaknesses. Ironically, the country whose president had proposed the idea never joined. The United States, despite the efforts of Woodrow Wilson, chose to not become a member after political opposition at home blocked the decision. Without the participation of one of the world's most powerful nations, the League's influence was limited. Even among its members, enforcement of decisions proved difficult. The League had no army of its own and depended entirely on the willingness of member states to act. In a world still recovering from a devastating war, many countries were reluctant to take strong action against aggression. The system relied on cooperation, but the political realities of the time often made that cooperation impossible. Across Europe, new borders had been drawn, but many ethnic groups found themselves living in countries where they felt like outsiders. Nationalist tensions simmered beneath the surface. In Germany, anger over the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of defeat became powerful political weapons. Radical movements began to exploit this resentment, promising to restore national pride and overturn the post-war order. By the early 1920s, it was becoming clear that the peace created after World War I was far more unstable than many had hoped. The war had ended, but the conditions that followed left millions feeling angry, insecure, and betrayed. Economic hardship, political extremism, and unresolved grievances were quietly reshaping the continent. The treaties signed in elegant halls in Paris were meant to secure peace for generations. Instead, they planted the seeds of future conflict. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and international agreements, a new and dangerous storm was already beginning to form. And within just 2 decades, that storm would erupt into the deadliest war the world had ever seen.
The early 1920s left Europe exhausted, unstable, and deeply uncertain about the future. The peace that followed World War I had not healed the wounds of the continent. Instead, it created fragile governments, angry populations, and economies struggling to survive. In many countries, democracy was still new and untested, and for millions of people, it seemed incapable of solving the crises they faced. Nowhere was this instability more visible than in Germany. The young Weimar Republic had survived revolution, attempted coups, and economic collapse in its first few years. The humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles still hung heavily over the country, and many Germans blamed their democratic leaders for accepting it. Although the economy began to stabilize slightly in the mid-1920s, the political atmosphere remained tense. Extremist movements on both the far left and the far right were waiting for an opportunity to take advantage of public frustration. For a brief moment during the late 1920s, it seemed as if Europe might recover. International agreements attempted to reduce tensions between former enemies. Cultural life flourished in cities like Berlin and Paris. New technologies, cinema, and music created a sense of modern optimism. But this fragile recovery was built on unstable foundations. In 1929, a financial shock in the United States sent waves across the entire world. The sudden collapse of stock markets triggered the global crisis known as the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses closed, and international trade shrank dramatically. Within months, the economic disaster spread across continents. Germany was hit particularly hard. Much of its economic recovery during the 1920s had depended on loans from American banks. When those loans were suddenly withdrawn, the German economy began to collapse again. Factories shut down,
Unemployment rose to terrifying levels. By the early 1930s, millions of Germans had lost their jobs and their savings. Families struggled to afford food and housing. Desperation and anger filled the streets. As economic conditions worsened, trust in democratic governments began to disappear. Many people believed that traditional political parties were too weak or too divided to solve the crisis. This environment created fertile ground for radical political movements promising strong leadership and national revival. One such movement was the Nazi Party, led by a man who had once been dismissed as an extremist agitator. His name was Adolf Hitler. A veteran of the First World War, Hitler had joined a small nationalist group in the early 1920s. Over time, he transformed it into a powerful political movement built on intense nationalism, propaganda, and promises to restore Germany's lost power. Hitler's speeches blamed Germany's problems on a wide range of enemies. He attacked the Treaty of Versailles, democratic politicians, communists, and minority groups. His message was simple but powerful. Germany had been betrayed, and only a strong new leadership could rebuild the nation. For many Germans who felt humiliated and desperate, this message was deeply appealing. But Germany was not the only country where democracy appeared to be failing. In Italy, political instability had already opened the door to a different form of radical leadership. In 1922, a charismatic and ambitious politician named Benito Mussolini marched his supporters toward the capital in a dramatic show of force known as the March on Rome. Soon afterward, he became the leader of Italy and began transforming the country into a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini promised order, strength, and national pride. Under his rule, political opposition was suppressed, the press was controlled, and the state promoted an aggressive form of nationalism. Many observers across Europe watched with interest. Some even admired the apparent stability that authoritarian leadership seemed to bring during times of crisis. As the Great Depression deepened, extremist movements gained popularity in several countries. In Germany, support for Hitler and the Nazi Party grew rapidly. Elections during the early 1930s showed a dramatic shift in public opinion. Parties that promised radical solutions were gaining millions of votes. The democratic system of the Weimar Republic began to crumble under this pressure. Governments rose and fell quickly, unable to form stable coalitions. Political violence between rival groups became increasingly common in the streets. Paramilitary organizations marched through cities, and clashes between extremists created an atmosphere of fear and instability. By 1933, the situation had reached a critical point. Conservative political leaders in Germany believed they could control Hitler by bringing him into government. They thought his popularity could be used to stabilize the country, while traditional elites maintained real power behind the scenes. It was a decision that would have enormous consequences. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he began dismantling the democratic system that had allowed him to rise to power. Political opponents were arrested, civil liberties were suspended, and Germany rapidly transformed into a one-party dictatorship. Across Europe and beyond, the rise of authoritarian leaders signaled a dramatic shift in global politics. Economic collapse had shattered confidence in democratic institutions. In their place, many people now turned toward regimes that promised strength, unity, and national rebirth. The world was entering a new and dangerous era. The political forces unleashed by economic crisis were reshaping entire nations. And in Germany, the rise of a radical new government would soon begin to challenge the fragile international order created after the First World War.
By the early 1930s, the global balance of power was quietly beginning to shift. The economic devastation of the Great Depression had shaken governments around the world and weakened the international system that was supposed to maintain peace. While many countries struggled with unemployment and political instability, several ambitious leaders began to pursue a far more aggressive vision for their nations. They believed the time had come to expand their power, their territory, and their influence. The first major crack in the fragile international order appeared in East Asia. In 1931, the military of Japan launched a bold and unexpected invasion of Manchuria, a vast region in northeastern China, rich in natural resources. Japanese officers claimed they were acting to protect their interests, but in reality, the invasion was a clear act of expansion. Within months, Japanese forces had taken control of the entire region and established a puppet state. The international community watched closely. In theory, this was exactly the type of aggression the League of Nations had been created to prevent. The League investigated the invasion and declared that Japan had acted unlawfully, but the organization had no real power to enforce its decisions. No military action was taken and no serious consequences followed. In response, Japan simply withdrew from the League in 1933 and continued expanding its influence in Asia. The message to the rest of the world was clear. International agreements and diplomatic protests were not enough to stop determined military powers. Meanwhile, dramatic changes were unfolding in Europe. In Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler had transformed the country's political direction. After becoming chancellor in 1933, Hitler quickly dismantled democratic institutions and consolidated power. His government openly rejected the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and began rebuilding Germany's military strength. This rearmament was technically illegal under the treaty, which had severely limited Germany's armed forces after the First World War. But Hitler ignored those restrictions. New factories began producing weapons, military training expanded, and the German army grew rapidly in size and capability. Many European leaders were aware of these developments, but few were willing to confront Germany directly. One of Hitler's most daring moves came in 1936. German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region along Germany's western border that had been declared a demilitarized zone after World War I. According to the treaty agreements, Germany was forbidden from placing military forces there. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a direct challenge to the post-war order. In reality, Hitler had taken a huge risk. The German army at the time was still relatively weak. If France or United Kingdom had responded with military force, Germany might have been forced to retreat, but no such response came. Both countries were still dealing with economic difficulties, and public opinion strongly favored avoiding another war. As a result, the German troops remained, and Hitler gained enormous confidence from the success of his gamble. At the same time, another authoritarian leader in Europe was pursuing his own ambitions. In Italy, the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini dreamed of building a new empire that would rival the glory of ancient Rome. In 1935, Italian forces launched a large-scale invasion of Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations remaining in Africa. The war was brutal. Italian troops used overwhelming military force, including modern weapons and aerial bombardment, against Ethiopian defenders who were far less equipped. Once again, the League of Nations condemned the aggression and imposed economic sanctions against Italy. But these sanctions were limited and ineffective. Crucially, they did not include an oil embargo, which would have severely restricted Italy's military operations. Without meaningful enforcement, the sanctions failed to stop the invasion. By 1936, Italy had conquered Ethiopia and incorporated it into its empire. The League of Nations had once again proven unable to stop aggressive expansion. As these events unfolded, a new pattern began to emerge. Authoritarian regimes were testing the limits of the international system. Each time they acted, the response from other nations was cautious and restrained, and each time they succeeded, their confidence grew.
Gradually, these aggressive powers began to form closer relationships with one another. Germany and Italy found common ground in their shared opposition to the post-war international order. In 1936, they announced a new political alignment that Mussolini famously described as an axis around which Europe would revolve. This partnership would eventually become known as the Axis powers. Soon afterward, Japan also moved closer to Germany, signing agreements that strengthened cooperation between the two countries. Although their regions of expansion were different, their goals were similar. Each nation sought greater power, greater territory, and a new global order that favored their ambitions. Meanwhile, the democracies of Europe watched these developments with growing concern but limited action. Leaders in Britain and France hoped that diplomacy, negotiation, and compromise might still prevent another catastrophic war. The memories of the trenches and the millions of deaths during World War I were still painfully fresh. But while the democratic nations hesitated, the authoritarian regimes continued preparing for a future defined by expansion and military strength. By the late 1930s, the international system created after World War I was beginning to unravel. Agreements were ignored, borders were challenged, and the institutions designed to protect peace proved unable to enforce their authority. The world had entered a dangerous new phase. Powerful nations were testing how far they could go without triggering a major war, and with each successful act of aggression, the path towards a much larger and more devastating conflict became increasingly clear.
By the mid-1930s, the international system created after World War I was beginning to crack under pressure. Aggressive powers had already tested the limits of global diplomacy, and each time the response from other nations had been cautious and restrained. Yet many leaders in Europe still hoped that another catastrophic war could be avoided. They believed that negotiation and compromise might keep the peace, even as tensions continued to rise. One of the most important turning points of this period began in 1936 with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Spain had been struggling with deep political divisions between left-wing Republicans and right-wing nationalists. When a military uprising attempted to overthrow the government, the country quickly descended into a brutal and complex conflict. What made the war especially significant was the way it drew in outside powers. The nationalist forces were led by General Francisco Franco, and they soon received support from both Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Germany and Italy sent aircraft, weapons, and military advisors to assist Franco's forces. For them, Spain became a testing ground for new tactics and technology. German aircraft carried out devastating bombing campaigns, including the destruction of the Spanish town of Guernica in 1937. The attack shocked the world and demonstrated the terrifying power of modern aerial warfare against civilian populations. Yet, despite the brutality of the conflict, most democratic nations chose not to intervene directly. The United Kingdom and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, hoping to prevent the war from spreading further across Europe. While the world's attention was focused on Spain, another dramatic development was unfolding in Central Europe. In March 1938, German forces crossed the border into Austria. The event, known as the Anschluss, resulted in Austria being absorbed into Nazi Germany. This action was a clear violation of the post-World War I agreements that had forbidden such a union. Yet once again, there was no military response from the major Western powers. Many people in Austria appeared to welcome the union, and the governments in London and Paris were reluctant to risk war over the issue. For Hitler, the success of the Anschluss confirmed his belief that the democratic powers would avoid confrontation whenever possible.
Soon afterward, Hitler turned his attention to another region beyond Germany's borders. In neighboring Czechoslovakia lived a large German-speaking population in an area known as the Sudetenland. Hitler claimed that these ethnic Germans were being mistreated and demanded that the territory be handed over to Germany. The crisis rapidly escalated during 1938. Czechoslovakia possessed a strong military and defensive fortifications, and it had alliances with other European powers. A war over the Sudetenland could easily have expanded into a major continental conflict. Determined to avoid such a scenario, the leaders of Britain and France pursued a strategy that would soon become known as appeasement. The most famous moment of this policy came during a meeting in September 1938 in the German city of Munich. There, representatives from Germany, Italy, Britain, and France gathered to negotiate a solution to the crisis. The meeting resulted in what became known as the Munich Agreement. Under the terms of this agreement, the Sudetenland would be transferred to Germany without war. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited to participate in the negotiations that determined the fate of its own territory. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London believing he had secured peace for our time. Many people across Europe celebrated, relieved that a major war seemed to have been avoided. But beneath the celebrations, the agreement revealed something far troubling. The willingness of the Western democracies to concede territory in order to preserve peace had convinced Hitler that they would continue to retreat rather than fight. Instead of stopping aggression, appeasement had encouraged it. Within months, it became clear that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond protecting ethnic Germans. In March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, destroying the independence of the state entirely. This action went far beyond the promises made at Munich and exposed the limits of diplomatic compromise. By this point, many leaders in Europe were beginning to realize that the policy of appeasement had failed. Each concession had only strengthened Germany's position and increased its confidence. The balance of power in Europe was shifting rapidly, and the possibility of war was becoming more difficult to ignore. Across the continent, military preparations quietly accelerated. Governments began strengthening their armed forces, building aircraft, and preparing defenses. The fragile peace that had survived since the end of World War I was now hanging by a thread. The events of these years revealed a harsh reality. The international community had repeatedly tried to preserve peace through negotiation and compromise. But aggressive regimes had interpreted these efforts as weakness, and with every step forward, the path toward a much larger conflict became clearer. Europe was now standing on the edge of a crisis that diplomacy alone could no longer contain. Within a single year, the final barrier between uneasy peace and global war would collapse.
By early 1939, the fragile peace that had existed in Europe since the end of World War I was rapidly collapsing. Years of diplomatic compromise, territorial concessions, and cautious responses to aggression had failed to stop the expansion of authoritarian powers. The international system created after the war was unraveling, and the continent was moving closer to a new and far more dangerous conflict. After the annexation of Austria and the dismantling of Czechoslovakia, it had become clear that the ambitions of Adolf Hitler extended far beyond the claims he had made during earlier negotiations. The promises given during the Munich Agreement were broken within months. German troops occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, demonstrating that the policy of appeasement had failed to contain Nazi expansion.
For the leaders of United Kingdom and France, this moment represented a turning point. They could no longer assume that Hitler's demands would end with the territories already taken. The next target soon became obvious: Poland. Poland occupied a strategic position in Eastern Europe and had regained its independence only after the First World War. One particular region, known as the Polish Corridor, separated Germany from the territory of East Prussia. Hitler demanded that Germany be allowed to reclaim control of this corridor and the city of Danzig. The Polish government refused, understanding that such concessions would weaken their country's sovereignty. In response, Britain and France made a critical decision. In the spring of 1939, they issued formal guarantees promising to defend Poland if it were attacked. For the first time since the rise of Nazi Germany, the Western powers were openly committing themselves to resist further expansion. Yet Hitler was already preparing his next move. German military planners began developing a strategy for a rapid invasion of Poland. But there was one major obstacle that threatened these plans. Germany risked facing war on two fronts if the Soviet Union decided to support Poland. To eliminate this risk, Germany turned toward a surprising and controversial diplomatic strategy. In August 1939, representatives of Germany and the Soviet Union signed an agreement that shocked the world. This agreement became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the surface, the pact was a non-aggression treaty between two ideological enemies. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had previously viewed each other with deep suspicion. But hidden within the agreement was a secret protocol that divided large parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. According to these secret arrangements, Germany and the Soviet Union would effectively split control of Poland and several neighboring regions. With the threat of Soviet intervention removed, Hitler was free to proceed with his plans. Early in the morning of September 1, 1939, German forces launched a massive invasion of Poland. The attack combined fast-moving armored units, coordinated airstrikes, and rapid troop movements in a strategy that would later become known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Polish defenses fought back with determination, but they were overwhelmed by the speed and scale of the German assault. Within days, cities were bombed, communication lines collapsed, and large sections of the Polish army were surrounded. The invasion was not only a military attack, but also a demonstration of a new style of warfare that emphasized speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. For the leaders of United Kingdom and France, this moment represented a turning point. They could no longer assume that Hitler's demands would end with the territories already taken. The next target soon became obvious: Poland. Within weeks, Poland was divided between German and Soviet forces according to the secret agreements of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Across Europe, armies began mobilizing. Governments prepared their economies for total war. The uneasy peace that had existed for 20 decades after the First World War had finally collapsed. The road to this moment had been long and complex. It began with the unresolved tensions of the Treaty of Versailles, deepened through economic crisis and political extremism, and accelerated through years of unchecked aggression. Each step, each decision, and each failure to act had pushed the world closer to a conflict that would soon engulf entire continents. By September 1939, the last barriers holding back war had fallen. The fragile peace of the interwar years was over, and humanity was about to enter the most destructive war in its history.